who was excited about being the chairman, and I said, why don't you take it? Anyway, my son actually went to the same prep school that Andrew went to, so I thought I'd come and make a connection. My son lives in Ontario, that had a universal basic income for their welfare recipients until they got this new Ford administration in who eliminated the program. But my daughter-in-law, who teaches in the Ontario schools in the Primes Valley schools, said that it seemed to be working very, very well. It had been working for maybe 3 years.
Yeah, it was supposed to go up to 5, and then they abbreviated it. It was terrible.
Yeah, that's conservatives.
Well,
so I'm very...
I mean, to me, it's really immoral if people are relying upon a commitment and they're told this for a certain period of time, that you then shorten the time period. It's like people making decisions. And that's true in that context. It's also true in the union context, because many workers obviously have representations that are made, and then it's like you have to rely on it. That's the way you do business, that's the way you have property.
And I also worked for the post office for 36 years, and all the years I was eligible to be a member of APWU, I was definitely a member. And then when I was a postmaster, I realized that those union benefits and those union contracts held up my job and my benefits. So definitely was grateful to them then.
Thank you, Martha.
So,
Let's give Martha a round of applause.
I'm Mark. I'm just a Des Moines resident. I'm trying to see all the candidates, and so your candidate worked in.
Yeah, you're being humble. I think Al described you to me as a very passionate activist, and whatever you say, then everyone listens to. Well, thank you. Just so afterwards, you'll have to tell me where I am in your
I'm Katie Wilson. I work for SEIU Local 199 in Iowa City, and I also work for the 5 to 15 campaign in Iowa. We just set up recently. So, and I'm here representing Kathy Glosson, who was planning on coming, but she is super sick today. So,
yeah, I hope she feels better.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Good morning, I'm Mark Cooper, and I have the honor and privilege of being the president of the South Central Iowa Federation of Labor, the AFL-CIO. I'm also a member of the Teamsters Union Local 727S here in Des Moines, Iowa. I'm a Des Moines resident, been here my whole life. I'm interested in all the candidates. Organized labor hasn't, all of organized labor has not made a choice yet, obviously. The firefighters have made a choice. But the rest of the field is wide open, and we're listening to all the candidates. I've had the pleasure of being able to sit down with Mr. Yang here a few weeks ago.
It must not have been that bad. Well, he's a journalist. You just want to say
Yeah, hey, that's me. I run Iowa Starting Line, and whenever a candidate is from my house, I make sure to
check the map. He's within the radius.
There we go. Come by.
Carl Schilling. I'm a retired civil rights worker. My union at that time was the Iowa United Professionals, which merged with the United Electrical Workers. Been with the union a long time. My wife is an ASME member for just as long, 27 years. And I've heard you before, like what you said, but I tell people that back a few years ago at a Jefferson Jackson Day dinner, which tells you how long ago it was, I left feeling pretty ticked off because we had about a dozen Democratic candidates speak at the dinner, and only one of them had one short sentence in support of unions. And I think one reason I'm here is that a candidate who will come forward and speak for unions deserves our respect, and we thank you for that.
I'm Jill Hope from Ocala, Florida, and I'm in Des Moines to meet my brand new granddaughter.
Aww. Oh, wow. Yay. Are you grandma for the first time, or?
No, my other grandchildren are in their 20s. So this is not an event. These are my children, and I am here to listen and learn. My first such event. So.
Wow, so fun. I'm Jeff, and I'm enjoying coffee. Looking forward to what you have to say.
Thanks, Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jennifer. I'm visiting from Florida as well. I'm involved in progressive activism there and interested to hear your ideas.
Thank you, Jennifer. Wow, some out-of-towners have
Welcome.
happened to me. Come on out. That's been fun. And then some camera folks over there, some volunteers. Well, thrilled to be here with you all. I was actually put on to this presidential campaign by a guy named Andy Stern, who used to run the SEIU. You looked up at that. I know Andy has something of like, a long history with labor, but he wrote a book called Raising the Floor in 2015 that talked about how the future of labor was going to be very, very fraught, in large part because of these economic changes and technologies that were going to displace many workers. And to me, this was a very important book, in large part because if you had technologists saying tech's going to take over the world, then you're like, yeah, of course you would think that. You're a techie. But then if you have the person who's been fighting for labor for decades saying tech is going to take over the world, and you're like, wait a minute, it is not in this person's interests or their natural perspective of the world to make that argument. So if he's making that argument, then he must be very, very serious. And I've come to the same conclusion independently over the period between 2011 and 2017. I had started an organization called Venture for America to help create thousands of jobs around the country. And so I'm a Northeast product. I grew up in upstate New York and went to high school in New Hampshire and then college in New England. But I'd never been to Michigan. Well, I've been to Michigan, but I've never been to Detroit, St. Louis, Birmingham, New Orleans, the cities in the Midwest that had struggled with the aftermath of automation until I started this organization, Venture for America. Now, I started Venture for America in part because I was shocked at what happened with the financial crisis, where all of my friends from Exeter had gone to work on Wall Street, and then some of them had literally built the financial instruments that ended up crashing the economy. So this is not a knock on our high school, it's just what smart kids do in this era. Unfortunately, they all went to Wall Street. And so when the financial crisis was on, I felt like I had something of an inside perspective as to why it unfolded. And so, to me, one of the problems was that we had so many developed pipelines drawing talent out of places like Iowa, frankly, and to places like Manhattan or in this era, Silicon Valley. And so I started this organization, Venture for America, to try and change that. It was very idealistic. I donated some of my own money to seed the organization, started calling rich friends and asking them, do you love America? And then the smart among them said, what does it mean if I say yes? And then I said, at least $10,000. So 12 of them said, I love America for $10,000. Like, I thought you did. And so had a few $100,000 to start, and then the organization grew and grew to a point where it had a real economic input, getting grants from the state of Ohio. I was honored by the Obama White House for helping create several thousand jobs in the Midwest and the South. But I've independently come to the same conclusion that Andy came to, because I saw that my work helping entrepreneurs in the Midwest and the South was like pouring water into a bathtub that had a giant hole ripped in the bottom, where the problems of automation and the brain drain were compounding and accelerating to a point where if I was helping these entrepreneurs create jobs, it was only going to be a very pale shadow of what is being lost. And unions are another part of this puzzle, because unions came up and up and up. And I was here in Ohio with someone from the UAW, and he gave me a documentary about the birth of the UAW, about a guy named Walter Reuther. And watching that documentary, I went home, I was like, oh, someone gives me a documentary, I'm happy to watch. I like documentaries. So I was watching with my wife, and it was staggering, all the stuff that people had to go through to originate the labor movement. It wasn't like, oh, people want rights, people want benefits, like, okay, let's give it to them. Instead, it was even worse than a knockdown, drag out battle. I mean, Walter was literally shot in his home, and I think more than once. And he ended up dying in a mysterious plane crash in the 70s. So it's like the fight for workers' rights was brutal. And then unions came up, and then unions now have lost about half their membership, a corresponding level of political clout influence. And what I say to the union workers when I'm with them is that you all are losing. You all are losing on an epic scale because our economy, again, is moving in this direction. So it was after 7 years working in the field that I started realizing, like, we need to go much, much bigger if we're gonna make changes. And a lot of, unfortunately, the mechanisms we have in place to make changes are fighting a losing battle. That's what Andy Stern figured out, that's what I figured out. That's what I'm trying to let people around the country know, is that if we're gonna make changes, they're not gonna happen in the ways that they might have happened in the 20th century. That there is no resuscitation of the economy of the 1970s. And what I say to folks, I quote my friend Eric Weinstein, who said that we never knew that capitalism was going to get eaten by its son, technology. And that all of the things you assume about capitalism, where if you start a successful company, you have to hire lots of people, you have to pay them reasonably well, you have to care about what happens in your backyard, the company town. None of those things is true anymore. I can start a very, well, not me, but you can start. One can start a very rich, successful company that does not employ lots of people. If it does employ a lot of them, it does not need to treat them well. Let's call them Uber drivers, something along those lines. And you don't care about what happens in your backyard because you're everywhere and nowhere. You're like a global company, you're selling wherever. And so what happens in your hometown is no longer that great an issue to you. I was with someone, the editor of the San Francisco newspaper, San Francisco Chronicle, and she said her biggest problem is getting anyone to care about what happens in San Francisco. Because the techies just sort of see it as an environment to do their work, but they don't actually care what's going on around them. Now you're looking at me, Martha, like that's impossible. But it's
It's sad, I was born in San Francisco.
have you been? I mean, if you've been back, it's transformed
Oh,
in
yes,
various ways.
oh, yes, and I haven't been back for many years, and I understand that it has,
Yeah, so we now have this supercharged version of capitalism that has gone beyond what anyone had ever imagined was possible. And the example I use is you have something like Amazon, this $1 trillion tech company that's sucking up vitality out of Iowa, frankly. Like it's leading to 30% of Iowa's malls and stores to close. Now, how much is Iowa getting back? How much did Amazon pay in federal taxes? Zero. So that's this version of capitalism. You have a $1 trillion tech company siphoning out $20 billion in commerce every year to a point where now 30% of your malls and stores are closing, and people in Iowa will see zero in return. And that's the way our current system works. So I essentially had to do work for 7 years in the field to figure out what Andy learned over like the number of decades. And so what Andy came up with was a plan called Universal Basic Income. Now it's not his plan. It turns out that Thomas Paine was for this at the founding of the country, called it the citizens' dividend. Everyone just gets a certain amount of money to meet your basic needs. Martin Luther King fought for it and championed it in 1967 in his book, Chaos Our Community, and it is what he was fighting for every single day until the day he was assassinated the following year in 1968. Milton Friedman and 1,000 economists signed a study saying this would be tremendous for America. We just put money into people's hands. And it was so mainstream that it passed the U.S. House of Representatives twice in 1971 under Richard Nixon. It's called the Family Assistance Plan, would have guaranteed everyone, would have guaranteed a family of four an income of $30,000. So think about what a game changer that would be. Now, Andy looked at this history and said, we need to bring this back now for workers, union and non. And if you put this $1,000 a month into people's hands, where would it go? What would people actually do with it in real life?
They spend it on my little town, which is dying.
Yes.
The retail's dying.
A little bit of it would float up to Amazon and the gang. Like you'd buy an extra toaster on Amazon. But most of it would flow right through your community, so to places like Gilroy's, to the retailers in your main street. It would create about 40,000, for support, 40,000 jobs here in Iowa. It would grow your consumer economy 12 to 15%. It would have a similar effect throughout the country. It would also help create paths for your young people, so your young people don't feel they have to leave to get certain types of jobs and opportunities. Because this stratification is happening between urban and rural areas and between cities on the coasts and other cities. The extremity of this economy is, again, unprecedented in our history. So this freedom dividend would help rebalance the economy and would help make it so that the Amazons and Googles and Facebooks and Ubers of the world actually have to pay like a tiny, tiny sliver of the value they're generating and return it to us, the American people. And then they get back some of it too, but then we'd all be stronger for it. And as a parent, I have two young kids. what excites me the most is that our children would be stronger and healthier, better nourished, have a better chance to learn. Mental health would improve, physical health would improve, domestic violence goes down, hospital visits go down. Ontario saw this, and it's common sense to us all. And some of you have connections to education. I know, Martha, your son's a professor. I actually come from a family of educators. It's kind of the family business. And studies have shown that 70 to 75% of kids' school outcomes are determined outside of the school. That's something we all kind of know. But what is that influenced by? That's parental time, how many words get read to the kid, parental income levels, levels of stress in the home, type of neighborhood. Things that happen outside of the school actually account for the majority of our kids' school performance. So we're putting teachers in an impossible situation where we're saying educate our kids, but you can only control 25 to 30% of it. And the teachers know this obviously. And so teachers know that if you were to put resources into the hands of the family, that would actually be the best way to help them do their job. And so this is one thing when you talk to teachers' unions and teachers, they're always fighting, again, a losing battle that's very similar to what other unions are fighting, is that your work is being presented as a cost. It's like, hey, we need to pay you, but we want to pay you just enough so you do your job and that's it. Whereas if you try and see what teachers are doing as an investment, then their dollar value can actually become very, very high, because it turns out a good teacher is worth his or her weight in gold in the classroom. And so by giving the teachers a better chance to learn, you can actually help teachers' unions. And also, this $1,000 a month ends up being a de facto raise for everyone, union or not. And one reason why Andy Stern loved this plan so much is that it would become a built-in strike fund for union workers. Because right now, unions know that if push comes to shove, their members are going to have a hard time meeting the mortgage payments and paying for their kids' practice and everything else. And so you can't go on a prolonged strike or labor stoppage. But if everyone's getting $1,000 a month, you can actually at least get by. And then management knows this. And management looks up and is like, holy cow, if we push this contract too far, they could legitimately stop working on us. And they're not going to starve to death. I mean, right now, our financial deprivation is being used against us systemically. 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, 57% can't afford an unexpected $500 bill. And this mindset of scarcity is one of the things that's making it very hard for us to solve any of our big problems, not just the economy of the 21st century, but also climate change. That if you have a population that is worried about paying their bills, then it's very hard to get them galvanized around things that they think are going to cost them money. So by putting this dividend into people's hands, we make families stronger, we make workers stronger, much harder to exploit, which ends up making unions stronger. And this can be a game changer for unions in a way that nothing else anyone's talking about will be. It will also help on climate change, it will help on education, it helps on like many, many different levels. It's the closest thing we have to policy that would be not a cure-all, but it would help accelerate our progress across many, many dimensions. And one example I use is that my wife is at home with our 2 boys right now, one of whom is autistic. What is her work included in our calculation of economic value right now, or GDP? 0. Like her work counts as 0. What is the market value of work at? 0. Also 0. The market's like, well, you're home with your kids, that's a 0. And we know that's the opposite of the truth. We know that her work is among the most important and vital work for our country's future. And so right now, GDP is being celebrated in our press and in DC. And our life expectancy has gotten shorter for the last 3 years because of the fact that suicides and drug overdose have overtaken vehicle deaths as the leading cause of death in this country for the first time in American history. You know the last time our life expectancy declined for 3 years in a row? The Spanish flu of 1918, 100 years ago. It's highly aberrant for the life expectancy in a developed country to decline for 1 year, let alone 3 years in a row. And to see it linked to this disintegration in our communities, a lot of it centered in post-industrial communities that have lost manufacturing work. That is the true story of this age. That is what brought Donald Trump into the White House in 2016. Donald Trump's our president because we'd automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, and 40,000 right here in Iowa. You all have lost 40,000 manufacturing jobs in this state, and all those communities have gone from wherever they were to much, much redder and more conservative. It's just the way the human mind works. If you sit down a conservative and tell them all these positive things, you're rich, you're invulnerable, nothing bad can happen to you, it's called priming them. And then you ask them a set of questions about politics and climate change, they actually express much more liberal and progressive values than they did before you primed them. It's a funny thing. The same works in reverse. If you sit a liberal down and say, you're sick, you're poor, like nothing good's ever gonna happen to you, like you prime them, then they actually get more conservative. So if you get rid of manufacturing jobs in a community, that community goes conservative very, very quickly. And this is one of the big points of confusion in the US. It's like, why would you go conservative? Like, shouldn't you be benefiting more from these social safety nets? That the Democrats like, no, they don't hear that. They just go towards the right. And this is one reason why this dividend is going to be so powerful, because there's one state right now that has a dividend where everyone in that state gets between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked. Do you know what state that is?
Alaska.
Alaska. And how does Alaska fund it?
Oil.
Oil. And what is the oil of the 21st century?
Technology.
Technology. Wind. Some people say marijuana. It's technology, it's robots, it's AI, it's software. This is the oil of the 21st century. What they're doing in Alaska with oil money, we can do throughout the country with technology money. And the great thing about this dividend is that it's actually very, very conservative in many ways. There are many, many Republicans and libertarians and independents and Trump voters that have embraced me and my campaign because they love the idea of the dividend. What do conservatives hate? Government making all the decisions for them. That's what conservatives hate. Conservatives do not hate economic freedom and autonomy for Americans. If they're getting $1,000 a month to do whatever they want with it, they love that idea. That's why this is so popular in Alaska, which is a deep red state. It was implemented by a Republican governor. And it's so popular that now it's been in place for almost 40 years, and it's like the favorite thing that the government does in the state of Alaska is the dividend. So this dividend is something that can unify our people and help move our society forward and helps reverse this entire polarization, this blue to red that's happening in our communities here in Iowa and elsewhere. What we say is it's not left, it's not right, it's forward. I don't know if you get this from me, but I'm relatively non-ideological. Like, I'm just trying to solve the problems of this day. And the greatest problem that we're facing is that our economy is evolving in ways that's pushing, it's already pushed 5 million manufacturing workers to the side, including 4 million just from machines and automation. It's about to push 30% of retail workers to the side as the stores and malls close. And being a retail worker is the most common job in the US economy. Average retail worker is a 39-year-old woman making between $10 and $11 an hour. So we know what her picture is going to look like when those malls and stores close. It's not going to be great. And we need to move before we get to automating the truck drivers. Because trucking is the most common job in 29 states, and only 13% of truckers are unionized. So this is not a union negotiation. Like 87% of American truck drivers are in these mom and pop. Like, I own a truck, I own 5 trucks, like, get some drivers, and we're making a business. So when my friends in Silicon Valley get trucks that can drive themselves on the road, which they believe they can do in the next 5 to 10 years, if we start automating away those 3.5 million truck driving jobs, that's going to be disastrous for this country, and it's not going to go well. Because a lot of those truck drivers will not go quietly, let's put it that way. Dozens of truckers just protested in Indiana. They did something called a slow roll, which is they just started driving their trucks slowly down the highway, and then everyone behind them obviously had to go slowly too. Now, what were they protesting? They were protesting the digital monitoring of their driving time, because there's a clock on them and they hate it. So the protest that they decided to do the slow roll. How do you think they're going to take it when it's their livelihood on the line? Tens of thousands of truck drivers are ex-military. You know, I mean, this is not science fiction. This is real life. In part because our economy has become so punitive and inhuman that we see economic value and human value as the same thing. That's why my wife gets 0. That's why there are these stupid discussions around how to turn coal miners into coders, which really makes no sense on the face of it. But we're so brainwashed into thinking that if you don't have economic value, then you have 0 value, that we then stretch for ridiculous, impossible transformations. you heard about the truck drivers too. I can't tell you when I say, hey, 3.5 million truck drivers, they're like, well, they'll get retrained. I'm like, have you been to a truck stop lately? You know, like a lot of these guys did not like school 25 years ago. They didn't like learn to love it in the last 25 years. And so these are unfortunately the actual conversations that are happening in DC. They present retraining as this cure-all when the studies show that only 0 to 15% of manufacturing workers were successfully retrained. Half of them left the workforce and never worked again. And of that group, half filed for disability, to the point where now there are more Americans on disability than work in construction, as one comparison. So this is all real life in the 21st century. Unions were a force for good in equity and workers' rights, and like Al was saying, 40-hour work week, overtime, like all that. But you've all been sucked dry and depleted. You've all been kneecapped at every turn. And here's the bigger thing about it, is that we've all been so brainwashed that now unions are somehow the bad guys. Because in this economy of maximal capital efficiency, like unions are the inefficiency. And it's like, why don't you all just, get with the program and, live on scraps and like somehow not have health care and the rest of it. But here's what I'm presenting to the American people, is that this capital efficiency machine is about to turn on us all. And it does not matter what your background is. It doesn't matter if you went to school for years and you're a radiologist or a truck driver or an accountant, or a cashier. 44% of jobs are either repetitive cognitive or repetitive manual. And what I tell people is I was a corporate attorney for 5 months, so I know that job can be automated. This is no longer like us and them. This is like a human thing. And so we need to get America's head up to focus on the real problems as fast as possible. Now, some of my friends have a math hat on, Edward. So Edward just moved to Iowa 2 weeks ago. Let's give him a round of applause. So math has a couple meanings. Number one is make America think harder. But the other is the applause line I've been using is that Donald Trump is our president today because he got the problems essentially right. When you remember in 2016, what was his argument? Make America great again. And then what was the Democratic response?
It's already great.
It's already great. And then we lost. And so what we have to do is we have to wake up to the fact that problems are real, that disintegration is real and ongoing. Our people are suffering. Donald Trump is our president because he pointed that out. But his solutions are the opposite of what we need. His solutions are build a wall, turn the clock back, magically bring the jobs back, and we have to do the opposite of these things. We have to turn the clock forward. We have to accelerate both our economy and society, and I am the ideal candidate for that task because the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math. Edward could be my body double. We could send him all over the way. We have a running joke in the campaign office about that. So that is what brought me to this race. And now this race, I have to say, I'm one of 11 candidates to qualify for the Democratic primary debates on the basis of both polling and donations. So thank you for anyone who did that. I know somebody did that. So I'm going to be on the debate stage in June and July. And most Americans are just tuning in, and they're going to turn on the TV that night, June 26th, and they're going to say, who is the Asian guy standing next to Joe Biden? And then they're going to Google Asian guy standing next to Joe Biden. And then our support's only going to grow. Already we're polling at between 2 and 3% in different polls. We've raised over $3 million in increments of only $19 each. So my fans are even cheaper than Bernie's. No one knew it was even possible. The Yang Gang is a very cheap gang. And a guy named Nate Silver looked at this and said, wait, if Andrew's polling at 2 to 3%, higher than many governors and senators, raising millions of dollars in increments of only $19 to all the grassroots, I'm neck and neck with Bernie in terms of grassroots fundraising, and his name recognition is lower than everyone else's, then we can't rule out the possibility that as more people find out about him in this campaign, he just grows and grows and grows and wins the whole thing. Because unlike all the other candidates, this campaign does not have a defined ceiling. And we are already drawing, again, thousands of Trump supporters and libertarians and independents. We're going to outperform all of the polls, in large part because our support base tends to be very young and very internet savvy, and those folks don't have landlines and never get polled. That's true. Yeah, so there are these factors that that are going to end up fueling this campaign that we surprise the whole way. But we certainly need your help to make the case to folks that are traditional Democratic voters for sure, especially in a place like Iowa, because that's who determines who wins here in the caucuses. So I'd love to take questions from you all, but I hope this gives you a sense as to who I am, why I'm running, and why $1,000 a month would actually be the biggest, most transformative policy we can make happen. One reason I love being here in Iowa is that you all can make it happen like this. You know, it's wild. Like if you embrace this vision, it will catch fire and just sweep the country. If you do not embrace this vision, then it will go nowhere. That's really, it's like the only two outcomes here. And if we do not take this vision to the rest of the country, then we're going to have 4 more years of the AI getting better, of the stores closing, of Amazon laughing its way to the bank, of eventually the self-driving cars and trucks hitting the highways. Like, we do not have that much time before this all becomes disastrous. We're in the 3rd inning of the greatest economic and technological transformation in the history of the country, what experts are calling the 4th industrial revolution. You all ever heard that term, 4th industrial revolution? Mm-hmm. No, that's a real problem. I say to people, it's like, when's the last time, like, have you heard a politician say those 3 words? And they're like, no, not until just now. And then I say, well, I'm barely a politician. So that's why I'm here, is because like America doesn't actually understand the transformation we're in the midst of. Right, so thank you for paying attention to my sort of modified self-introduction. Do you guys have any questions I can help answer, dig into, particularly the folks who are here in the state that I've seen, let's say 9 other candidates? Martha.
Tell us about how our medical health insurance has impoverished us for 30 years and what we can do about it. And I understand, I know 20 years of the Canadian system, so.
You do? That's great.
Yeah, well, I don't know. But, I mean, it is great. It is great, absolutely. There are something better we can do, and it's enslaved us and impoverished us.
So this is one of the things the Democratic Party is, is making immense progress on, which is trying to move us towards Medicare for all. So that there are 3 sources of inflation that are making Americans miserable right now: housing, education, and healthcare. Those are the big 3. If you look at consumer items, they're actually not going that much up in price. Clothing, media, electronics, cars, are they getting better or cheaper for the most part? But housing, education, and healthcare are weighing us down. And so when you're talking about how our healthcare system's impoverished us, Martha, you're correct. We're spending 18% of GDP on our healthcare to worse results than other countries. And it's in large part because it's just super costly. The entire system is very, very expensive. And it's expensive because many of these device companies and drug companies are profiteering at unprecedented levels. I have a friend who's an investor in these companies, and she said she's never seen numbers anything like it. She says that it's so extreme that it actually appalls her, and this is like a hard-boiled capitalist. But she says like these numbers are so extreme that she's now betting against these companies. She says like these companies, like there's no way this can go on. So she's now betting against those companies, and then she's supporting my campaign, saying like I hope you can help make it right. So we're spending twice as much as other countries because our system is designed around revenue generation and not healthfulness. And it's in part because our healthcare providers' incentives are in those directions too. So I have a lot of doctor friends, and if you talk to them, they'll say, it's like, sure, like, am I prescribing extra tests and procedures because 1, I get paid more for those things, and 2, I can be sued if I don't do them, and something happens? It's like, yeah. And you can see it where if their incentives change, then all of a sudden, what happens? They do fewer procedures and they prescribe fewer tests. That's what happens in the Cleveland Clinic, where doctors just get paid a flat salary, and like what they prescribe that like has nothing to do with their comp. Then all of a sudden, like the amount of activity goes way down. So what we have to do is we have to try and change the incentives of our healthcare practitioners. Now, a lot of their incentives are distorted by the fact that they're coming out of med school with $250,000 in debt. And so you have this primary care desert around the country, including a place in Iowa, because there aren't MDs. Now, why aren't there MDs? Because if you have this $250,000 in debt, then you don't want to be a primary care physician because you get paid less, and you don't want to practice in a rural area because you get paid less. So the logical thing to do would just be to train more doctors, right? We have so many young people who'd love to be doctors, and we have a massive need. So of course, what's constraining the supply of doctors? The medical lobby. The medical lobby says, no, how about we just keep a constant level of constant number of doctors? And then even when you try and say, hey, how about nurse practitioners can then act like doctors in rural areas? That's a reasonable solution. Again, the medical lobby says no. So we have to break up the artificial constraints on the delivery of healthcare at the MD level. We have to expand the supply. We have to say, look, if there are no MDs in that area, then we're going to have to empower nurse practitioners and other professionals to help deliver healthcare accessibly and cheaply. And if we can change the incentives, this is the beauty of it, is that people are concerned about the cost of Medicare for all. Because we're already overspending to this level, then that's coming through to our families and businesses through the increased cost to both individuals, and we're all paying higher prices on things because that company then has to pay all of its employees' healthcare costs. That if we can get this healthcare cost structure under control, it's going to be a massive boom for the economy. And I know this because I've run a company or two or three, and our current system makes it harder to hire people. It makes it harder to treat people like full-time workers because you just want to make them a temp worker and then say, I don't have to pay for your healthcare. It makes it harder for people to start companies. It makes it harder for people to switch jobs. It's actually this massive source of friction in the economy. And that if you can get it out, then it's going to actually be like this massive boom for dynamism. It's a bit of a long-winded healthcare question. Oh, sorry, answer. But I want to say, like, there's a similar situation going on in our education system, where if you have kids who are college age, you're like, how the heck did college get so expensive? Like, how did it get 2.5 times more expensive in the last 20 plus years when it did not get 2.5 times better? And so there's a similar situation going on in education where they built up this massive cost structure. The costs have gone up, and then families have felt they had no choice but to pay for it. So you have now 1.5 trillion in school loans, up from less than 100 billion in 1999. So think about those numbers for a second. You have like less than 100 billion 20 years ago, and now 1.5 trillion. It's unprecedented again. And so now we have kids graduating from college with average debt loads of 38,000. Their underemployment rate is 44%. So if you go to college, there's about a 50-50 chance you're doing a job that does not require a degree. And the school doesn't ever come back and say, oh, what's that? Like, things are tough, let me forgive some of that debt. I mean, that doesn't happen. So it's become this similar problem to healthcare. And because these are nonprofit institutions, then they're sort of cloaked in this, like, we can do no wrong, everything we do is good, the bigger we get, the better things are. So the shifts are, number one, we have to stop selling college to every high school kid. Because the more resilient paths, actually, many of them are in the trades, for the folks who are in the trades. Only 6% of American high school students are in technical or apprenticeship or vocational training. In Germany, that percentage is 59. Think about that gulf. 6%, 59%. And so right now, the trades have millions of unfilled positions that are going to be with us for a long time. It's very, very hard to have a robot plumber or a robot electrician or a robot line repair person. It's actually easier to have an automated accountant or insurance agent or financial advisor than it is like a robot plumber. And so we need to have more of our young people get trained for the jobs that will be with us for a long time. And those jobs are actually very lucrative, they're rewarding, they're gratifying, but right now we are stigmatizing them. We're saying to our kids, hey, it's college or bust, go to college, and then it's the wrong move for many of them. And you can see that in the depressed graduation rates. 41% of people who are starting college are not finishing within 6 years. A lot of them probably should not have gone to college in the first place. And again, when they get those loans, they keep them. The loans never go away. So one of the things I'm going to do as president is I'm going to forgive a big chunk of the student loan debt, because a lot of it was immorally generated, and the choices between having our young people living at home with their parents trying to pay off these loans, or going out there and buying homes and starting families and starting businesses. And to me, that's a very easy choice. We should try to put our young people in a position to actually do the things that we need them to do, instead of servicing this 1.5 trillion in financial debt. Yes.
Sorry I arrived late, maybe you've already covered.
Probably not.
Unions a fair amount, but I'm a member of the largest public employees union, AFSCME, and I am mortified about what's happened here in Iowa with the undercutting of our unions, and what people talk about a lot is the teachers.
Yep.
I'm not one, but that's what people tend to grab onto and understand best. I have a son who's going to school to be a teacher right now, and he's already thinking, well, now, you know, I'm gonna have a better career if I leave Iowa and go somewhere else.
Wow, that's
because of what they've done to unions here.
Yes.
But we have a whole generation of young people who weren't raised in a culture that appreciates the history and what unions have provided to us as a society.
Yeah.
So how do we, you said, so unions have become the bad guy, and I agree with you.
Yeah.
How do we change that? How do we make our young people understand that they need to stand up and help support the right to unionize and the right to have a good pension and a future and a career that might be, you know, encased in a life as a member of a union, when culturally we're moving so far away from that. So speak to that a little bit if you can.
No, it's a great, that is in many ways the question, like the challenge. So the best thing you can do to get someone excited about unions is obviously to have them in a position where they experience the benefits themselves or someone in their family. So the major shift you would need is to actually have it so that union membership, instead of like steadily declining over the last number of years, actually starts to rise again. Now it rising would require a fundamental change in the bargaining power and the dynamic between like labor and employers. And labor's been losing for years. And it's not just in the union context. 94% of the new jobs created in the US since 2005 have been temporary gig or contractor jobs. So there's this notion of like the company and like the employer-employee relationship that it's sort of like family. I mean, that's like gotten like totally thrown out the window. And young people now don't even like imagine that would be possible.
That's my point.
Yes, don't
So,
even imagine that would be possible.
That's my point. How do we change that?
And so to me, it's like so there are a few steps to this. Number one, we put the economic resource in everyone's hands. So like everyone's getting an extra $12,000 a year. And then that ends up supercharging the power of workers to both organize and bargain, and labor unions to start reversing the long-term decline. Because right now, what happens, let's take a hypothetical environment where you could potentially unionize. What percentage of those organizations unionize right now, in your opinion?
What do you mean, those organizations?
Like if there is like a situation where there's like a pool of employees that could theoretically join a union and organize and say either like, hey, what I'm suggesting is that most of the time they're not going to actually organize and join a union. And the reason they're not going to do it is because there would need to be someone leading and organizing among those workers saying, I'm going to stick my neck out, I'm going to say, hey, we should totally join a union or start a union. And then the odds of that person getting fired, like getting their shifts cut, like having their economic future undermined, 99% probably. And so like the odds of that person sticking their neck out go up a lot in a context where everyone's getting $12,000 a year, and they know that, hey, if this employer decides to can me, I'm not going to die. Like I'm going to go home, like I'm getting $12,000 a year, like my family members are getting $12,000 a year. What's killing us right now is essentially an atmosphere and mindset of scarcity. And that scarcity is what's going to keep that person from sticking their neck out, keep that group of people from organizing. It's also what keeps us from making progress on climate change. It's what's exacerbating the sense of tribalism that's going up and up, because in an economy where people don't feel like they're getting enough, it's very easy to scapegoat other people. Who's getting scapegoated right now?
Immigrants.
Immigrants, right. When immigrants have very little to do with the economic problems. And what I tell people is like, look, if you go to an Amazon fulfillment warehouse, it's not immigrants. Like it's machines and robots. And so the scarcity is actually causing an increase in tribalism. Like it's making us more anti-immigrant. It's making us more anti-woman, in my opinion. Like that, there are a bunch of things that this mindset of scarcity is driving. And the only way to combat this mindset of scarcity is through a mindset of abundance. It's like, you can't go from, right now in my opinion, scarcity is winning in this country 60-40, 65-35. You put $1,000 a month into people's hands, it doesn't go from 65-35 to like, 100% abundance, but it probably reverses the scale, so it's more like 60-40 scarcity. And in a 60-40 or 60-40 abundance environment, then labor gets stronger, unions get stronger, more people stick their necks out, and then you start making it so that your son starts seeing unions as something that is not a bad thing, but a good thing. It's one reason why this plan that I'm running on was championed by Andy Stern, the former president of SEIU, because he looked at this and said, labor needs a game changer. This is a game changer. And the wild thing about this game changer is like, if the first time you saw it, you were like, well, that sounds nice, but that can never happen. But if people in Iowa decide to get behind it, it can happen. And it's vital, it's necessary. And it becomes common sense very quickly, because if we're a democracy, what is stopping us from declaring ourselves a dividend? Mm-hmm. Like as like the owners and citizens and shareholders of the country, if 51% of us stand up a month, then it will happen. It's so interesting is that like really what we have to do is we have to wake up our fellow Americans to that fact, that possibility. And it's a little bit like union organizing light. It's like citizen organizing light. It's like, hey, but there are no cards this time. we just need to, to vote it into effect. But yes, this was originated by a labor leader. This idea. Katie.
Yeah. So first to speak to your point about young people in unions, I think part of the problem is young people actually really support the idea of having unions. It's more that we don't have a lot of opportunities to be in them because job opportunities are so low for young people, even those of us who've graduated from college.
Right.
And so I'm one of those folks who went to college when I probably shouldn't have and graduated with tons and tons of debt, have waited tables most of my life, and didn't have a good income or good benefits until I got a chance to be part of a union. So we understand it. It's more the issue of how do we get into positions where we can be part of a union. And that's also part of strengthening unions, right? Is making them more available to more people. So for those who may not be familiar with Fight for 15, I'm part of Fight for 15. We are an arm of SEIU that does work with workers who are traditionally not organized into unions. So fast food workers, hotel workers, all of those folks. And one of the things we talk about is that $15 should be the minimum wage, but also that folks should have access to a union no matter where they work. And right now, like low-wage fast food workers can't organize into unions. So we're doing a non-traditional model of organizing. So I guess my question to you, Mr. Yang, is how do we, when we have this $1,000 a month basic income, how do we ensure that companies like McDonald's or Walmart don't then decide that that's enough for you and to keep wages low and to stop people from having their basic needs met outside of that $1,000? How do we ensure that those corporations don't do the wrong thing? And I guess the question really is, how do we help strengthen unions so that they can really be a part of that conversation and that movement?
You know what's interesting is that when you're trying to model out what happens to wages in a country where everything is $1,000 a month, it's possible that fast food wages might actually have to go up. And think about why that is that right now the people who are doing that job literally need that job just to make it ends meet at all. But if all of a sudden they didn't need it for their very survival, they'd be like, do I really need to do this this job where they treat me like poorly and the rest of it? And then if you needed someone there, you might be like, you know what, I actually have to like take it up a notch and like try and pay them a bit more. Because right now, companies are treating workers like, again, like whatever the minimum I can pay you is what I'm going to pay you. And workers know this, and so workers don't feel valued. So there's a chance that, at least in that context, you might actually see wages rise because no one wants to do that job for, $7-8 an hour if they don't need to. So that's one very interesting dynamic in that industry. You can see different effects in different places, but the least pleasant work actually might have to pay more because now it's not the issue that I have to take to survive. I'm all for the spirit of the fact that people should not be working full time and not being able to make ends meet. And right now, many Americans are in that position. They're working 2 or 3 jobs, and that's something we have to try and put a stop to. You had a question?
Yeah, in a way, it's related too. Non-compete clauses in restaurant workers and fast food places. For people who say they believe in capitalism and competition, having non-compete clauses at that level is really disrespectful and just evil, I think. What can you tell us about it, of the future of it?
Well, I'm surprised that courts would find them enforceable and so you know more than I do because I haven't seen the actual treatment of these agreements if you get brought to court over it. But one very common practice is that companies give you a non-compete, you sign it, and then if you actually violate the non-compete and you bring it to court, they actually can't win on it because courts take a very negative view about anything that restricts your ability to work and freedom in that way. So unions are, one very powerful institution for it. These non-compete agreements generally are not considered that powerful. It's like that. There are a lot of workers that are confused about them because they sign them and think like, oh, I signed it, so it must be obviously legal. Like I'm in trouble if I break it. Truth is, most of them you can break, and the court will be like, what are you gonna do? In my experience. So we'll have to double check on that, but that's been my direct experience with non-competes. Is like most people don't think they're worth the paper they sign them. Does that make you happier?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
No, I know, I certainly, as I joked, I was a lawyer for only 5 months. But I do remember the non-competes being not very.
But the problem is the cost of taking those to litigation for food
Yeah.
service workers. Also the fact that food service workers work for kind of a gang of thieves who agree among themselves not to honor these non-competes.
That would be your bigger problem.
Mhm.
Correct.
And
The bigger problem would be employers saying, well, I'm gonna shaft you because
we'll hire a renegade.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, rule breaker.
That's the real problem, I think.
I think there'll be a bill against it in the Iowa legislature, but it won't pass this year.
Against which?
Swallow.
Question for the insurance that the very expensive house make many people cannot get adequate or enough test and medical treatment because the insurance company do not allow.
Yeah.
Do you think that insurance company should make some change that give more profit or give more opportunity for the basic health for every single individuals?
No, I support a Medicare for All program because that's the best way to get the incentives aligned towards people's health. And I've seen what's possible in other contexts where if someone needs some tests done, they should be able to get them done, and it's actually not that expensive. Like right now, most of the expenses that we see in the healthcare context are ridiculously inflated. We've all heard the horror stories. It's like, what, I got stitches and I owe $700, or I did an ambulance ride and it was $5,000. It's like one day in the hospital, $25,000. So the prices are really arbitrary. And when you get down to the true cost of it, it ends up being very, very modest, as long as there's not someone on the other end that needs to make tons and tons of money. So the answer is yes, we can make it so that you can get those tests and it's reasonable.
And how?
It's not that insurance. Well, so Medicare has very high levels of satisfaction and low cost, and it's not even able to negotiate on drug prices right now. So if you were to free up Medicare and say, look, this is the new program, we're going to lower the eligibility age, and Americans are going to be able to participate, which Americans would be thrilled, just to be like, what, I'm like, I have healthcare coverage and I don't need to, go broke getting it. And then we could get the access up and the cost down just by essentially like making the prices more reasonable. And you could have many more practitioners who are able to provide them and make a modest profit, maybe not some of the profits they're used to, but you can make a modest profit. And that's one of the confusions around is that Medicare for all doesn't mean all doctors work for the government. It just means that you have reimbursed the government, so there's still private businesses operating.
In Canada, they run their own offices, they're independent.
Yeah, which
Totally independent.
is ideal. Well, thank you so much. We do have very fancy hardcover copies of my book, really for anyone here. What you needed to do in order to get the book was really just what you already did, which was just spend some time with us. So thank you all so much. We'll see you at the debate stage in June, and I come back to Iowa every couple of weeks. I'm here today because there's a tech conference that a guy named Ben Milne, who's the founder of Douala, is putting on, and Ben's a friend. And so Ben said, we need to have you come speak. So my being in the States very, very commonplace. I'll be here all the time. So please let your friends know that the Young Gang is going to keep on growing, and we're going to make history together in 2020. Thank you all.